ship in the fjords when a good crew of rowers was swinging to the oars. A good rowing boat is generally a bad sailor, but Olaf had made the Crane swift enough under canvas, or to speak more accurately, when her sails of brightly dyed wool were spread. She was given high bulwarks, and must have had more than the usual 4-foot draught of water, for she carried plenty of heavy stone ballast to stiffen her undersail. With the Crane as his flagship, Olaf sailed northward to attack the Viking Raud, pirate and magician, who held out for the old gods and the old wild ways. Raud had another exceptionally large ship, the longest in Norway, until the Crane was built the swiftest also. The bow, carved into a dragon's head and covered with brazen scales, gave Raud's ship the name of the Serpent, Ormen. As Olaf sailed northward, Raud and his allies met him in a skirmish at sea, but soon gave way to superior numbers, and Raud, when he steered the Serpent into the recesses of Salten Fjord, thought he had shaken off pursuit, especially as the weather had broken, and wild winds, stormy seas, and driving mists and rain squalls might well make the fjord inaccessible to Olaf's fleet. Raud sat late feasting and drinking, and in the early morning he still lay in a drunken sleep when the Crane slipped into the fjord despite mist and storm, and Olaf seized the dragon ship and made Raud a prisoner almost without striking a blow. When the king returned to Trondheim, he had the two finest ships of the north, the Crane and the Serpent, the latter the largest, the former the swiftest vessel that had yet been launched on the northern seas. Proud of such weapons, he wondered if he could not build a warship longer than the Serpent and swifter than the Crane, and he consulted his best shipbuilder, Thorberg Harklover, i.e. the Hair Splitter, so named from his deftness with the sharp adze, the shipwright's characteristic tool in the days of wooden walls. Thorberg was given a free hand and promised to build a ship that would be famous for centuries. This was the Lang Ormen, or Long Serpent, a dreadnought of those old Viking days. She was 150 feet long, and her sides rose high out of the water, but she had also a deep draught. The bow, strengthened with a cutwater of steel, was fashioned like the head of a huge dragon, the stern carved into a dragon's tail, and bow and stern were covered with scales of gold. She had 60 oars, and her crew was made up of no less than 600 picked men, among them warriors whose names live in history. For a while Olaf, with his great ships, reigned victoriously over Norway, defeating more than one effort of the old pagan Vikings to shake his power. One of these defeated rivals, Erik Jarl, Earl Erik, took refuge in Sweden, gathered there a number of adherents who had like himself fled from Norway to avoid Olaf's strong-handed methods of reform and conversion, and with them sailed the Baltic, plundering its coast in the old Viking fashion. King Svend of Denmark was jealous of the power of Norway, welcomed Erik at his court, and gave him his daughter's hand. Svend's queen, Sigrid, was a Swedish princess, and Erik set to work to form a triple league against Norway, of which the three branches would be his own following of Norwegian malcontents and the Swedes and Danes. Olaf had spent the summer of the year 1000 with a fleet of 60 ships in the southeastern Baltic. Autumn was coming, and the king was preparing to return home before the wintry weather began, when news arrived that hastened his departure. It was brought by one of his jarls, Earl Sigvald, who came with 11 ships, manned by his clansmen, and reported that the rebel Erik had been joined by the kings of Sweden and Denmark, and the three fleets of the allies were preparing to fall upon Olaf on his homeward voyage. But Sigvald assured the king that if he would allow him to pilot the Norwegian fleet, he would take it safely through channels deep enough for even the Long Serpent, and elude the hostile armada, which outnumbered Olaf's fleet 3-1. Sigvald, however, was a traitor. He had promised to lead Olaf into waters where the allied fleets would be waiting to attack him, and he knew they would be anchored inside the island of Rügen, near the islet of Svold. So Olaf, trusting to his false friend, sailed westward from Wendland to his last battle. The saga tells how on a bright morning Erik Jarl and the two kings watched from Svold the approach of the Norwegian ships, and at first doubted if Olaf was with them. But when they saw the long serpent towering above the rest, they doubted no longer, and gave orders for their 180 ships to clear for action, agreeing that Norway should be divided among them, and the long serpent should be the prize of whoever first set foot on her deck. So sure were they that numbers would give them the victory, even against a champion of the seas like Olaf Tryggvason. The swift crane and the short serpent, taken from Raud of Salten Fjord, had sailed ahead of the fleet. They saw the ships of the Allies crowding out of the channel between Svold and the mainland, and turned back to give the alarm. Thorkild, the half-brother of Olaf, who commanded the short serpent, urged the king to bear out to sea and avoid a fight with such desperate odds. But Olaf's blood was up. Like the triremes of the Mediterranean, the serpents, dragons, and cranes of the northern seas used only the oars in battle, and the king gave the order which meant fighting. "Down with the sails," he said. "Who talks of running away? I never fled yet and never will. My life is in God's hands, but flight would be shame forever." The battle that followed is the most famous in Viking story. We know it chiefly through poetic records. But there is no doubt the saga preserves for us much of the living tradition of the time, and if its writers yielded to the temptation of decorating their narrative with picturesque detail, it must be remembered that they told the tale of Olaf's last sea fight to men who knew from experience what northern war was like, so they give us what we chiefly want, a lifelike picture of a Viking battle. Just as Shakespeare tells how at Shrewsbury the king had many marching in his coats, and to this day in an Abyssinian army several nobles are dressed and armed like the king to divert personal attack from him, so as he stood on the afterdeck of the Long Serpent, Olaf had beside him one of his best warriors, Kolbjorn Slatter, a man like himself in height and build, and wearing the same splendid armor, with gilded shield and helmet and crimson cloak. Round them were grouped the picked fighting men of the bodyguard, the Shieldburg, so called because it was their duty to form a breastwork of their shields and ward off arrows and javelins from the king. On the poop also were the king's trumpeters bearing the war horns, long horns of the wild ox, which now sounded the signal for battle. The droning call was taken up by ship after ship, as the shouting sailors sent down sails and yards on deck. The ships closed on each other side by side and drew in their oars, forming in a close line abreast, and then under bare masts the long array of war galleys, with their high bows carved into heads of beasts and birds and dragons, drifted with the current towards the hostile fleet. The sailors were lashing the ships together as they moved. Maneuvering appears to have had small part in most Viking fights. The fleet became one great floating fortress, and as the ships met bow to bow, the best warriors fought hand to hand on the forecastle decks. The writer of the saga tells how in the center of the fleet the Long Serpent lay, with the Crane and the Short Serpent to port and starboard. The sterns of the three ships were in line, and so the bow of the Long Serpent projected far in front of the rest. As the sailors secured the ships in position, Ulf the red-haired, who commanded on the forecastle of the Long Serpent, went aft and called out to the king that if the Serpent lay so far ahead, he and his men would have tough work in the bow. "Are you afraid?" asked the king. "We are no more afraid forward than you are aft," replied Ulf, with a flash of anger. The king lost his temper and threatened Ulf with an arrow on his bowstring. "Put down your bow," said Ulf. "If you shoot me, you wound your own hand." And then he went back to his post on the forecastle deck. The Allied fleet was now formed in line and bearing down on the Norwegians. Sigvald Jarl, who had lured the king into this ambush, hung back with his 11 ships, and Olaf with his 60 had to meet a threefold force. King Svend, with the Danish fleet, formed the enemy's center. To his right, Olaf's namesake, King Olaf Svensker, led the Swedish ships. On the left was Eric, with the rebel heathen Jarls of Norway. Olaf watched the enemy's approach and talked to Kolbjorn and the men of the Shieldburg. He did not reckon that the Danes or the Swedes would give much trouble. He said the Danes were soft fellows, and the Swedes would be better at home pickling fish than risking themselves in fight with Norsemen, but Eric's attack would be dangerous. "These are Norwegians